All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's MetalCon Live, Decoding the Language of Rainscreens, presented by Andrew Ashton with Centria in partnership with RAiNA. Right, RAiNA is one of our MetalCon Association partners. To learn more about the Rainscreen Association in North America, you can visit their website. And you can mark your calendars for August 23rd when our next MetalCon Live will take place, presenting Justifying Role Forming versus Other Processes, presented by Brian Rogers with FormTech. And if you have not done so already, MetalCon registration is open. We will be at the Las Vegas Convention Center from October 18th through the 20th. You can register today and use code 30RAiNA during registration and save $30 on your pass. And at MetalCon, RAiNA will be hosting an in-person workshop. It is called Installer Training for Rainscreen Assemblies. In addition, they will be speaking at 2 free educational sessions on the show floor. One is integrating cladding in Rainscreens and the difference between the two, and what makes Rainscreen walls work. To check out all of our education courses, visit metalcon.com/education to learn more. If you have any questions during the session, please leave your comments in the chat box or in the Q&A section, and it will be answered. And finally, after this webinar is over, you will receive an email with a survey to fill out. You will receive AIA credits, and you can download your certificate of completion. Now I will leave it to Andrew to begin.
Thank you. Can we see the screen all right?
Yes, you can. You're all set.
Tremendous. All right, so good afternoon, folks. Well, I guess good afternoon to some, good morning to others. My name is Andrew Ashton, and I am the Business Development Manager at Century Architectural Panel Systems. I currently serve on both the Executive Committee and Board of Directors for RAiNA, which is the Rainscreen Association in North America. I also had the very distinct honor and privilege of being the co-chair for the RAiNA Definitions Committee for the first 2.5 years of its existence. The presentation we have for you today is going to dive into a little bit of that experience. The presentation is Decoding the Language of Rainscreens. Just a sec. All right. So Rainscreens are not a product, they are an assembly. And the assembly is comprised of building components installed by different trades. Different trades use different terminology. And the question has been posed of how do we come to a common language? Well, RAiNA has spent the last 3 years decoding the Rainscreen language and developing terms and definitions for components and functions used in the Rainscreen industry, as well as navigating how to actively and effectively communicate them throughout the construction design industry. This session is going to explain the various components of a Rainscreen assembly and the functions that these Rainscreens provide. Today's learning objectives, we'll learn the process RAiNA undertook to develop terms. Can everyone hear me okay? Looks like we're having some audio issues reported here in the chat.
I can hear you just fine.
Okay.
If someone else could answer and let me know if they can hear as well.
Okay, looks like we're up and running.
Okay.
Thank you for that.
Perfect.
So for today's learning objectives, we'll learn the process RAiNA undertook to develop terms. We'll review terms and definitions associated with the Rainscreen assembly and why the terms are important to communicate effectively. We'll translate Rainscreen terms into common construction language for accurate and safe communication. And we'll aim to understand the importance of appropriate terms and their usage to ensure accurate and safe communication amongst stakeholders. So in order to understand the work that is being done on this topic, it's important to know who is doing the work. So we'll start by discussing the organization of RAiNA in its entirety. We'll take a look at the approach by our definitions committee. And as for the heart of our discussion today, we'll focus on the effort that went into defining the word Rainscreen. And then finally, we'll look at some terms and how they relate specifically to RAiNSCREEN. So 10 years ago, I was working on a project, specifically a RAiNSCREEN project, that was really a sweet spot of an opportunity. It was one of those jobs where everything perfectly aligned from the start. The proposed materials satisfied the architect's intent. It met the performance requirements, and really, we were off and running on this project. We were able to optimize the layout, so we had very little waste, and we maximized the usage of our subframing, the assembly behind the panels for that particular application. This kept us very budget friendly and even more sustainable with a reduced waste factor. It was really the ideal project. The size for our manufacturing capabilities meant we could easily meet and exceed the schedule. And this was a project that I was really proud to be a part of. It was a win across the board for all parties and all stakeholders involved, or so I thought. It was until it wasn't, let's say. I was called out for a job site inspection as they were having some issues with the panels on site. I pulled up to the job site, and at first glance, from the parking lot, everything looked to be in order. I donned my brightest and safetiest safety green vest, my hard hat, and my steel toes, and I made my way to the project elevations that I would be inspecting that day. Now, as I got closer, something appeared to be a little bit off. The panels that I was looking at had this beautiful waviness to them. Let me clarify. The very, very flat panels that I had specified on this project had a beautiful waviness to them as they were installed. Now, this was an open joint RAiNSCREEN system, and this particular project called for baffled joints. For those that aren't familiar, this meant that where panels came together, where the panels met, there was a thin piece of brake metal covering that joint to help reduce any sort of water infiltration and provide a particular aesthetic that the design team was very fond of. Upon inspecting these baffles, it became alarmingly clear of what was going on with this particular install. The installer had fastened the panels through the baffling, so they had pinned them in place, and added sealant to create a watertight install. They had effectively installed flashing at the joints. Some of you already know where this is going. For others, we'll get there together. It was right around this time that the foreman for this crew walked up, and he proceeded to very calmly and eloquently inform me how terrible my company was and that our products were absolutely inferior. Truth be told, he was neither calm nor eloquent, and I don't know that I'd ever heard so many four-letter words in such a short span of time. Once the steam had stopped coming out of Mr. Foreman's ears, I was able to share my thoughts on what was happening with the system. Now, Mr. Foreman rebutted. He didn't really care to hear my thoughts at the moment. And he cleared off some space on the nearest pallet of subframing. He opened his set of drawings, slammed them down, and pointed at the detail in question. And there it was. Right in front of me, I could see that every bit of material that had been labeled aluminum trim or aluminum baffle trim that had existed on the original construction drawings had been relabeled flashing on his shop drawings. A tiny little change that made sense for the folks that were working through the project, but didn't make sense for the application. And boy, this installer, let me tell you, he was terrific at installing watertight flashing. Unfortunately, this seemingly innocuous mistake resulted in a porous RAiNSCREEN panel being installed as a barrier system. It was completely watertight at the joints at the top and the bottom. And the method of install didn't account for thermal movement, didn't account for drainage or ventilation, and the panels were paying the price. If not corrected, not only would we have this terrible fail in the aesthetics of this porous material, the wall assembly really was a ticking time bomb to failure. Fortunately, this story does have a relatively happy ending. I spent the morning talking through some basic RAiNSCREEN principles with the requirements for this type of panel and this application, and together with Mr. Foreman, we were able to develop a simple cost-effective fix for what had been installed and set them up to have a successful install moving forward. What does this have to do with RAiNA? Who RAiNA is in its simplest form is a collection of industry members who all have their own version of the story and collectively realize that we can do more together than trying to fight these battles alone. As a result, manufacturers, architects, engineers, Installers, consultants, building scientists, and even other trade associations came together in 2020 to form the RAINSCREEN Association in North America. These are the member companies that came together. This is the group that has formed RAiNA. And you can see here, it's a pretty healthy cross-section of industry, including manufacturers, consultants, architects, contractors, and even other industry groups. So this is the core of the RAINA organization. And I do apologize. I know that there are some additional members that have added. We have not updated this slide quite yet. That's on me, but we'll get that updated for the next presentation. So now that we've come together, what was the next step? We've got everyone like-minded. We're here. The next step really was to create some alignment. So every day RAINA is collectively working towards realizing our vision and our mission while upholding our values. RAINA's vision statement is to be the recognized RAINSCREEN authority, supporting performance-driven RAINSCREEN assemblies that contribute to more durable, resilient, healthy, and energy-efficient, safe buildings. RAINA's mission statement is to work together with our membership, industry, and trade to be the recognized authority on RAINSCREEN wall assemblies in North America. And the RAINA values that we operate by include the integration of expertise, building science-based performance criteria, sustainable, long-lasting building enclosures, all with the approach of design aesthetics in the forefront. Now, the goal is to become established as an industry leader and authority on RAINSCREEN, but by no means does that mean that we aim to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of good work that's been done out there, a lot of good work that exists, and folks that we believe the opportunity to collaborate with will sort of be beneficial to all parties involved. So these collaborative efforts are underway with assorted groups across the industry, as shown here. This has taken form in different ways, including a memorandum of understanding, or an MOU, with ABA, as well as education series and partnerships with groups such as the MCA and MetalCon, as we see today. As it stands today, there are 108 company members actively participating in RAINA. We've got a few different categories here. We've got our component material supplier or master distributor category. And these are companies whose primary business in the RAINSCREEN industry revolves around supplying material that you produce or produce through contract manufacturing agreements. Also includes companies whose primary business revolves around serving as the national supplier of products and components produced by other entities or entity. The testing agency and code body, which includes any organization accredited as a standard development organization. We've also got associate members, which are a company who supplies minor components that get utilized in RAINSCREEN wall assemblies, such as fasteners, flashing, or other minor materials or accessories. Also includes the contractors, fabricator and distributors, and independent sales reps. The industry professionals are going to include the trade associations, industry groups, universities, technology and trade schools, as well as architectural, engineering, and consulting firms, specification writing firms, and building inspectors. Now, there is a relatively equal split across a few categories. I think in the recent months, we've had an increase in some of the manufacturing groups, so that might be a little bit of an uptick than we see here. But as we continue to grow, there will be a concerted effort to target additional contractors, architects, and specifically testing agencies and code buddy groups. So everything that we do begins with RAINA members. The structure of RAINA includes a member-elected board of directors, a board-assigned executive committee, and then 7 committees where the work gets done. These are made up from volunteers from the 108 member companies. These include our building codes committee, which serves as the leader and influencer of codes as it relates to RAINSCREEN wall assemblies. They maintain a list of pertinent national and local codes and work to identify changes and additions within the codes that influence RAINSCREEN assemblies. We've got our definitions committee, which we'll talk about more later on today, but this committee's primary focus is to identify a baseline of understanding of RAINSCREEN terminology in order to provide guidance to the AEC community for promotion, code development, design, and construction. We've got our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, who's been tasked with developing and supporting the implementation of policies and strategies to ensure the association fosters a diverse, equitable, and inclusive culture, both within the organization and across the larger AEC space. Our Education and Training Committee, whose goal is to identify and determine the best delivery methods for educating, design, and construction industry. This committee is tasked with design and development of education and training materials on RAiNSCREEN assemblies and the best practices for their construction. We've got our Industry and Outreach Committee, which is now housed under the Executive Committee. This one is up and running very effectively, so we were able to free up some of our resources. They're tasked with identifying and coordinating initiatives to grow RAINA's presence, partnerships such as MetalCon here, and influence throughout the industry. The committee oversees trade shows, social media, press, website, and advertising. We've got our RAiNSCREEN Performance Committee, which is far and away the largest committee within the organization. The RAiNSCREEN Performance Committee works on all RAiNSCREEN technical aspects, including performance requirements, project specification details, install practices, RAiNSCREEN test methods, and material specification. The committee works hand in hand with many other committees, such as the Building Codes Committee, Definitions Committee, et cetera, to ensure an objective and science-based approach support all aspects of the organization. We have our Residential Committee, which is a relatively new committee. It works to increase the knowledge and awareness of RAiNSCREEN principles through education and development of industry standards, to improve resilience, durability of single and multi-use homes. And then we have our newest committee. In fact, they just had their second meeting just yesterday, and that's the Retrofit Committee. And the Retrofit Committee was born out of a clear need for guidance with respect to assessment, planning, and implementation of RAiNSCREEN retrofits. So this committee is developing a guideline, case studies, and other educational resources to raise awareness and to meet the growing demand for RAiNSCREEN retrofits. So that, in a very long-winded nutshell, is the RAiNA organization. All right, let's get into the Definitions Committee. So as I mentioned, I had the honor of co-chairing the Definitions Committee for the first couple of years, and I can confirm it is a combination of a very, very challenging, very eye-opening, terribly frustrating, and extremely rewarding committee to engage in. It has really been quite a challenge to navigate some of these terms, just because you've got so many folks involved who all have different perspectives, and we'll learn later that that's actually a huge benefit. But reaching consensus, as you can imagine, is quite a challenge. But why did RAiNA need a definitions committee to begin with, and to what end? At first, it seemed a little bit counterintuitive. The organization was comprised of folks that live and breathe RAiNSCREEN, and so we obviously all spoke the same language, or so we thought. With a diverse membership group, it became very clear that on the face value, right? So at the most basic, we were speaking the same language based on the origin of what we were talking about. But those terms had evolved. Those terms had evolved greatly over the years. So we saw terms vary by geography, by organization, or even when we used different phases of a project cycle, those terms would shift, as we saw with that earlier story, what kind of challenges that could present. So once this was identified, the plan to address this became pretty straightforward. We would focus on alignment and standardization, and we would house a definition subcommittee within the performance committee. That has not happened yet because the definitions committee is still a standalone group, and you'll see why in just a bit here. We decided that we would conduct a member survey. We didn't know what we didn't know, so we would have to check with our group. But we knew we couldn't be far off, right? Not too many terms would be defined. We were all, again, relatively speaking the same language. And we would lean heavily on available industry resources. So let's see what's out there, let's get consensus, and let's move on. So we had a plan to make pretty quick work of what was tasked to us. So with our member survey, we had two goals. We wanted to find out what, and we wanted to find out how often. We asked what were the most problematic terminology companies struggled with while facing customers, and how frequently did they engage with these terms? The member survey results were a bit of a surprise. There were 189 terms deemed problematic. That means in our everyday function as manufacturers, as architects, as designers, installers, et cetera, there were 189 terms that we face every day that create some sort of chaos or a story similar to the one I shared earlier. We were able to reduce that down a little bit, and we got to 149 unique terms. There was, some crossover, some doubling of things, maybe some slight changes to how we listed them, but we got to 149. We then cleaned that up to 55 priority terms. And then we had to start somewhere. So there was a push towards picking one and beginning, and it was unanimous across the board that top priority word was going to be RAiNSCREEN. The RAiNSCREEN Association in North America defining the term RAiNSCREEN. That should be easy, right? I mean, we already had a plan. We were going to find our industry source, come to a consensus, and on to the next term. This path was the least resistance and what we imagined would be our approach for not only RAiNSCREEN, but for most terminology moving forward. It was time to hunt and see what we had to work with. How many resources could we find? And we did a deep dive and found a mix of trade organization resources, codes and standards, published works. And at the end of our research effort, we had 26 different resources that we could investigate. And you may recognize quite a few of these that we have in front of you. Of these 26 resources, can we get any guesses as to how many times we found the word RAiNSCREEN defined? Feel free to type it in the chat. Best guess. How many times could we find it? 24. 24 is a good guess. 0. All right, got opposite ends of the spectrum here. Of these 26 documents, still taking guesses, how many times did we find the term RAiNSCREEN defined? All right, so there's an anonymous attendee who nailed it. And three times in these 26 documents were we able to, or pardon me, 26 sources, multiple documents, were we able to find RAiNSCREEN defined. 3 definitions existed within these resources, and 2 of them were identical. Here's an example of one of those definitions that we were able to locate. A cladding system and or rain control strategy that accepts that some water will penetrate the outer surface, the cladding which screens rain, and removes this water back to the exterior by gravity drainage or drainage plane, CWRB, water control layer, through a drainage gap, and exiting via flashing and weed pulls. The term is used imprecisely in practice as it may apply to a drain system or apply only to systems that have larger drainage gaps, to systems that are also ventilated, a ventilated drained approach, or to systems that attempt to pressure equalize. See also drained, drain screen, pressure equalized drain screen, water control layer. As you might imagine, if I were to hand this definition to Mr. Foreman as a part of our conversation, I would be missing teeth today. This is a tremendous definition, and this is from a document called RAiNSCREEN History, something that I refer to relatively frequently when having conversations about RAiNSCREEN. But the challenge with this definition is that it assumes a high-level baseline knowledge. It references multiple other definitions, and it confirms that definition is used improperly in practice. This, like the other available definitions, did not align with our intent. Our goal from the start was to translate RAiNSCREEN terms into common construction language for accurate and safe communication. From our research, we recognized that it was now time for RAiNA to define RAiNSCREEN. We got some questions popping in here. Oh, it looks like perhaps the chat is disabled. If our host here could open the chat, that would be tremendous. We have some more questions popping in.
I see that. It looks like it's for everyone, so I'm just gonna test it right now and see if
Okay,
everyone can see that.
I can see that.
Perfect. If someone else wants to throw their question into the chat, just to make sure we get it, and then you can answer it and we can go from there as long as it's working.
Okay, appears to be still disabled. All right, well, we'll move on. And folks, if you have anything, we'll use the Q&A box until we can get that chat function addressed. All right, so moving on to defining RAiNSCREEN. So if we were going to be successful, we needed to establish some ground rules. We didn't have anything specific to start. There was no sort of guidelines or playbook on how to start an industry group and define terminology. But we did have a group that was committed to making this happen. And over the first couple of months, our bi-weekly meetings structure did develop. We wanted to focus on creating a succinct list of definitions. We could do things that were paragraphs long, but we felt something that was within 1 or 2 sentences was going to be our focus as an organization. We wanted to, of course, remain product neutral. There was no intent here to give any one product or component or application type any advantage. It was intended to be as neutral as possible and give everyone sort of a fair chance here. Wanted to leave performance criteria to the performance committee. There was a lot of discussion about including the specifics of how these systems would be installed to achieve different performance requirements. However, we were making a definition. We were creating a definition. We weren't creating a specification. Looks like the chat is open. Thank you, Jenna and James, for confirming. Intent does not a definition make. This was one thing that we really struggled with early on in our conversations about defining RAiNSCREEN. Everybody knew what everybody else meant, but that wasn't enough. We couldn't simply say, here's my definition, you know what I mean. So there was a lot of pushing back and challenging each other to ultimately push towards a definition that was going to be functional for our organization. And then valuing diversity. As we were discussing RAiNSCREEN, we were looking at the scope that we specifically specialized in. Manufacturers were focused on cladding and components. Consultants were focused on performance aspect. Architects were looking at design. My co-chair at the time, who was a lobbyist for brick industry, she was focused entirely on possible litigation, and she let us know, and it was absolutely tremendous. But these different experiences and focuses brought value through diversity. Now we know that a RAiNSCREEN is a type of water management system. Oh, pardon me. We know the RAiNSCREEN is a type of water management system. So water management systems include mass walls, barrier walls, drainage system, and multi-component assemblies. And we'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. We also know that RAiNSCREEN is not just cladding. The system performance is dependent on what parts and pieces make up that wall assembly. We know when we see it. So this is a definition for something else out in the world, but if you know, you know. But it's interesting that this was sort of a revelation in our definition conversation. If we knew it when we saw it, we were able to start building some parameters around what it was and what it wasn't. And it actually led us to this next point of, as we worked towards our definition framework, we focused on finding examples of where it didn't apply, trying to poke holes in it. And I assure you that some of the engineers and building scientists on the call had way too much fun with this part of the exercise, figuring out ways to challenge other folks on the call and making things, sort of work and not work. It was really quite a tremendous effort. So first, we need to understand the water management system. And there are several traditional strategies used to protect buildings from bulk water. And these assemblies generally fall into the categories of mass walls, which are designed to absorb water, then slowly release that through evaporation. It's also one of the oldest technologies in existence for resisting rainwater. So examples of mass walls are going to include concrete tilt-up, concrete masonry, structural brick, and stone. Barrier walls are characterized by a single layer, which must repel all rainwater. There's no redundancy in this system. Then we've got drainage systems, which have a water-shedding exterior layer, a cavity, and a redundant drainage plane. One quick thing I want to point out that the materials that we use in that mass wall assembly can absolutely be used in a drainage type buildup. This is just how we kind of classify them at a much higher level. So we knew that RAiNSCREEN would live somewhere in the world of this drainage type system, but where would we draw the line? The line was drawn ultimately with air. In order for something to be called a RAiNSCREEN system, there had to be sufficient air movement. Venting or ventilation had to occur in some way. And I get this question still to this day, but Andrew, how much air? Well, that is the million-dollar question and something our performance committee is actively investigating. But as I mentioned before, we were writing definitions, not specifications. The amount of air we needed would be an amount sufficient enough to dry the cavity. So through our exercise, we reached consensus that RAiNSCREEN is not a product, material or building type specific. We can see here that each of these RAiNSCREEN systems has three key aspects, regardless of material composition or wall type. We have an outer layer, typically cladding, what we see here, a cavity of various configurations, and an inner layer, typically with a WRB. Oh, pardon me. So after 6 months of research, discussion, deliberation, some hurt feelings probably along the way, we reached our definition. A RAiNSCREEN, as defined by RAiNA, is an assembly applied to an exterior wall, which consists of, at minimum, an outer layer, an inner layer, and a cavity between them for the sufficient for the passive removal of liquid water and water vapor. Exciting stuff, right? I know I can't see everyone's face right now because we're online, but I'm sure eyes are wide and mouths are agape. Everyone's very excited. So let's take a look at the definition with a little graphic behind it. We can kind of put some parts and pieces together. So that's an assembly applied to an exterior wall, which consists of, at minimum, an outer layer, an inner layer, it's number 5 here, pardon me, number 2, a cavity between them, and sufficient for the passive removal of liquid water and water vapor. So a RAiNSCREEN isn't just the sort of exterior parts and pieces, it's everything working together to create this performance. That it can include a cladding attachment, structural support, the exterior insulation that we find in the cavity, whatever sort of air tightness control, such as the air barrier system behind the parts and pieces that go into that cavity, and then our vapor diffusion control, which is going to be our vapor retarder or vapor barrier. Every component is going to have a role for performance in this type of system. So before we jump into any further definitions, any questions on RAiNSCREEN? I know it's very exciting stuff. Oh, hello, Exton PA, hello. All right, we'll move on to some other terminology. So having such a high level definition for RAiNSCREEN, it gave us the opportunity to expand on specific components and types of systems. So working from the outside in, we were able to define components like cladding or RAiNSCREEN cladding, which might not always be the same. We took a look at cavity, exterior cavity, drainage cavity, RAiNSCREEN cavity. And at first glance, we could say these are all the same thing. Why are we taking the time to, define these differently. And we'll take a look at some of this in just a minute. Moving back to the system, we've got our water control layer and our non-load bearing wall element. This also, of course, allowed us to be very specific with the types of rain screens that we wanted to define. It's a very open term, right? It's very inclusive. So we had to get more specific for certain applications. So we defined vented to get to drained and vented rain screen. We defined ventilated to work towards drained and ventilated rain screen systems. And then, of course, everyone's favorite, the pressure equalized rain screen or pressure moderated rain screen, which we'll talk about in just a sec here. So, as I mentioned before, the goal was to communicate clearly and effectively to sort of create some common terminology with these terms as we define them. So we can see here the word cavity was one that we developed and built upon to work to make these as consumable and accessible for both the building scientists, that are working every day in and out to push us toward the limits of what we can do from design to construction, to the folks that are in the field doing it, to Mr. Foreman, so that we all understand what we're talking about. We're all on the same page. So we'll see how we build upon this. So we've got cavity, which simply put is a space in a wall assembly. The exterior wall cavity is a space in an enclosure wall assembly between the cladding and the backup wall. A drainage cavity is a space in an enclosure wall assembly between the cladding and the water-resistant barrier that provides a passive means of directing liquid water to the exterior. A rain screen cavity is a space in an enclosure wall assembly between the cladding and the water-resistant barrier that provides a passive means of directing liquid water to the exterior and sufficient airflow to remove water vapor. So at first glance, pretty basic concept, right? Start simple and expand on it. And this is how we as RAiNA have established our definitions approach. We want to make sure that there's a baseline understanding with the terminology and that we can continue to build and add complexity as is necessary, not for the sake of complexity. We were able to carry that approach over to more specific rain screen assemblies as well. In this case, we defined vented, which is limited passive exchange of air between the cavity and the exterior through openings. And note there's a contrast with ventilated. Ventilated is the passive exchange of air between the cavity and exterior through multiple openings that facilitate a more uniform airflow. With that, we were able to define more specific rain screen assemblies, drained and vented, and drained and ventilated specifically. And we worked into theoretical situations such as pressure equalized rain screen, which led us to the practical application of a pressure moderated rain screen system. And this is an interesting position that RAiNA has taken regarding these types of rain screen systems. There are folks that are pushing that pressure equalized rain screen is something that we actively can install, and I think there was some learning and some bumps along the way through RAiNA's discovery that pressure equalized rain screen is more of a concept. It's more of a theoretical position. So in this case, a rain screen assembly where, in theory, the air pressure acting on the exterior of cladding is always equal to the pressure in the rain screen cavity, thereby resulting in no pressure difference across the cladding. The more practical application of this concept is going to be a pressure moderated system. Excuse me, jump to slide here. Pressure moderated system, which is a rain screen assembly where the pressure acting across the cladding is substantially reduced, but does not achieve the theoretical state where pressure on the exterior is always equal to that in the rain screen cavity. So quite a lot of terminology defined over the last few years, and not as much as perhaps some folks might like to see. But again, this is not something where we've been able to rely entirely on existing resources and it satisfy the intent of the definitions committee of RAiNA. So there's been a lot of combination of working with resources out there, but still working on our own approach. Other terms that are in progress currently include the drainage plane, flashing, subframe or subframing, cavity depth, and even fasteners. We'll hit some RAiNA highlights here. So again, RAiNA has over 108 member companies at the moment. One thing that I do want to call your attention to that we are very excited to see is that the RAiNSCREEN definition that we discussed earlier will be in the 2024 IBC. So the International Building Code will show RAiNA's definition of RAiNSCREEN. It'll be added to some definitions that are going to be associated with exterior coverings. So it's all very exciting stuff. Oh, that one's coming at us. So with that, that will actually wrap up the majority of our presentation today. And I saw that there was quite a few questions just about RAiNSCREEN in general, which I am more than happy to address. But today's focus was really on RAiNA as an organization and how we went about defining RAiNSCREEN. So with that, we'll open up the floor for any questions.
All right, Andrew, and while we're waiting for any more questions to come in, there was one that came in earlier about what group is handling field inspections. I just wanted to make sure that one came through and you answered that to the fullest if you needed to add anything else in that sense.
Yeah, so for field inspections, we don't currently have a group that is handling that specifically. What we are working on is doing trainings. We have the Education and Training Committee. So we're working on making sure that we've got folks sort of knowledgeable, understanding what's going on with this type of stuff. If at some point we do reach that field inspection level, we'll definitely publish that. But at the moment, there is no one that is addressing that. Folks, yes, you can get access to the slides. I'll be happy to share that. Certificate of attendance will be provided. There'll be a survey coming here shortly. Presentation will be available.
Yep, so an email is going to be sent to everyone who attended afterwards as well with a link to the presentation and the video along with the survey and where you can download your certificate of attendance. So that'll all be given to you after the webinar. And then Andrew, another one came in as a standard being developed for fasteners and their effects on the WRB.
Not that I'm aware of, Gordon, thank you for the question. Not that I'm aware of at the moment, but fastener is definitely actively being a focus in terms of the definition committee, and there's some discussion of the performance committee, but I'm not sure, or I'm not aware of specifically investigating the effects in the WRB. Donald, is it truly possible to have a pressure equalized system? That's sort of where we took a pretty strong position on that. From our perspective, having a truly pressure equalized system is not something that we can achieve. It's something that we drive for when we actually design a system and call it pressure equalized. But true pressure equalization across the entirety of a facade is cyclical at best, but never truly equal across that system. So we really aim to moderate pressure that is applied to these exterior systems. Will a replay? Yep, there will be a replay of the webinar available on YouTube. You'll also receive an email and a link for that.
All right, looks like another one came in. So by definition, the inner layer sees same pressure as exterior surface question. And a few others are in the chat as well.
Yeah, let me pop over to the chat here.
Perfect.
No, so the inner layer shouldn't see the same pressure as the exterior surface. The exterior surface we know will mitigate some of that pressure, so there will be a drop, as pressure pushes through at joineries and depending on where we're at across the elevation. So no, we will not see that same pressure on the interior surface. We can talk a little bit about Corey, a little bit more about that offline. What are the main advantages of a RAiNSCREEN system to traditional cladding solutions? Well, the traditional cladding solutions are many, but ultimately when we do install something with a RAiNSCREEN in mind, our focus is to create some redundancies in that system. So we have an outer layer that's going to mitigate most of the water infiltration into that wall assembly. We then have a cavity that allows for the water that does penetrate to drain out of the bottom or ventilate through the top. We've got a WRB that is behind that and typically exterior insulation in that cavity. Ultimately, this assembly, when installed right, is going to ease some of the pressures that we have on that building in its entirety. So we'll ease some of the loading requirements for that building, as well as make sure that we've got a nice watertight application. Is the relationship of assemblies to NFPA 25 part of the code committee's work? We don't have any direct influence over NFPA 285 at the moment. We've got members that are actively participating in NFPA 285 as well as RAINA, but no, we are not influencing directly any of the assemblies specific to NFPA 285. There's a question about a CPD certificate. I'm not familiar with that. Regarding attendance for today's presentation.
Yes, I see that as well. There will be a certificate of completion. I can follow up and see about a CPT certificate and in relation to that, and I can follow up with you specifically on it.
Perfect. I see some folks sharing some maybe some critique of a RAiNSCREEN performance system, as well as other definitions. And yeah, that's honestly we love to see that. So if there's anyone who's interested in learning more about how things are defined within our organization, has something they'd like to contribute, we love to get that feedback. If you're interested in perhaps joining, we can always have that conversation. But if you'd like to just perhaps sit in on a meeting and see the conversations that are underway and what we're looking at, by all means, please feel free to reach out. Got some contact information up on the board. Our admin Jenna is participating in today's meeting. She's sitting in, and she'd be more than happy to direct you to folks that we can link up and have these discussions. Carl, thanks for sending over that definition. Hey, Robert, has any thought been given on how to repair the inner walls as a part of building maintenance? I think that might be more of a manufacturer specific inquiry. It'll depend on sort of what they need to provide to get access to those inner layers, but definitely something that the performance committee may be tackling before too long. Is the RAiNSCREEN system linked to the U value of the materials? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. The RAiNSCREEN system as a whole obviously will account for the U value of the materials, but we'll take a look at that holistically. Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean with that question, but if there's something you'd like to discuss again offline, I'm more than happy to jump on it. Lance, yeah, I would say that in some senses, things sure are more complicated than they used to be. I think that's part of our effort as an organization is to try to sort of streamline and simplify that quite a bit. In its simplest form, a rain screen is not so complicated, right? It's an outer layer, an inner layer, and allowing for sufficient drainage and um, ventilation to occur. And so we kind of want to get back to those roots of it's not overcomplicated design of RAiNSCREEN. We just want to make sure we all understand the basics and that we're approaching it with a similar mindset. So yeah, Sophia, good question about RAINA RAiNSCREEN contributing to building sustainability. So this one of the big benefits of a RAiNSCREEN system is we are effectively moving all of the enclosure materials to the exterior of that structure. So as I mentioned before, it's going to provide a system where when we have exterior insulation around the building, we're going to have much less load activity acting on that structure overall. So for sustainability in terms of what we require to build that structure, it's going to be less requirements. We have continuous insulation that we can do with most of our RAiNSCREEN systems. They're going to allow us to have the correct mechanicals in that building. So we're sort of right sizing the energy requirements of that specific building. So there's a whole slew of different benefits of using a RAiNSCREEN system that we can definitely discuss further about versus a conventional facade system. Our RAiNSCREEN is part of the US GBC recommendations, not as a standalone, not like a single product as a RAiNSCREEN, but the science of continuous installation is definitely something that US GBC highly recommends. And moving that to the exterior of a facade, RAiNSCREEN is a very sort of easy way to accommodate meeting some of those continuous installation requirements. In your literature, is thermal short circuits through the system addressed? Not specifically, not in terms of short circuits where we're typically talking about small penetrations. We do take a look at thermal bridging. We do discuss thermal bridging and how we can help mitigate that, typically with various forms of thermally broken attachment methods or true continuous insulation. Those are ways that we can work to mitigate that overall. I know that there are some studies underway to see sort of what happens through a continuous installation and how impactful those penetrations are. So I think that kind of ties in a little bit more to the idea of short circuiting. But as of now, I don't have any firm data that I can provide on that. Oh, Wilmer, thank you. Okay, thank you for the clarification. Yeah, so the RAiNSCREEN system can help reduce that thermal break and that thermal kind of short circuits, as Donald was just asking. So if we have a system in which we're installing working from the inside out, we're installing our exterior sheathing, and then we're installing our thermally broken framing along with our exterior insulation. We can have a pretty highly effective way of insulating the exterior of that building and help reduce that thermal short, and also drive the U value to wherever we really need it to be from a performance standpoint. One thing I will point out, though, is we're talking about the RAiNSCREEN system when we talk about that U value. And so the insulation in the cavity is going to be a driver of that U value. Typically, because of how the system is designed and there's sort of open air movement behind the system, the cladding itself is not typically going to contribute to that performance. It's really the assembly buildup. Yeah, thanks for that question. What was the load language when using continuous insulation? Um, Oh yeah, so it's just going to reduce the stress on the structure itself. So we can call that live load. So it's good. There's going to be less movement from the exterior of that. There's going to be less thermal movement through the exterior, and we're going to see less movement of the structure overall. So as mentioned earlier, this is a lot of really great questions that are coming in, and we're kind of just sort of the tip of the iceberg here in talking about how we defined RAiNSCREEN. There's so much left to discuss in terms of when to use a RAiNSCREEN, when not to use a RAiNSCREEN, what value it brings from the performance of your building. What materials to select, how do we build up to be effective in our particular application. And we will continue to provide educational series along with MetalCon, who has so kindly provided a forum for us here. And some of these future conversations will include more specifics. We can get into the weeds on how to install, what to install, as well as the MetalCon event that's coming up here in October. We'll be doing some free education series there, as well as an installer training. So if anyone's interested in seeing sort of how these parts and pieces come together, why we do what we do and how we do it, that'll be a great opportunity. And then the last slide that I'll share with you today is for an upcoming event that we have in New York City. So for anyone that is in New York City, we're going to be hosting a RAiNA conference at the Building Energy Exchange. It will be a day of speaking. In the morning, we'll talk mostly about the organization specifically. So that's primarily for current members. However, if you would like to learn more, please don't hesitate to reach out. And then the afternoon will be a series of keynote speakers. We'll have Steve Gaynor from our executive committee from Pivot, and he'll be giving us an overview of some of the fire code changes that are occurring in New York City. We've got Gaby Brenner, who will be providing some information on how we're addressing retrofit in New York City. And then finally, we'll have John Straub do what John Straub does best and give us an overview of RAiNSCREEN and the applications that we're looking at here today. And then one thing I'll throw out as well, if you're unable to make it in person, there will be some virtual opportunities as well. You can sit in on these and see what John has to say.
All right.
If there are no other questions, yeah, I think we can give you all 3 minutes of your day back.
Yeah, sounds good. You can all keep an eye out for an email with the survey and the option to download your certificate of completion. If you have not done so, you can go to metalcon.com and register for MetalCon using code 30 RAiNA to save $30 on registration. And again, just a huge thank you to Andrew and RAiNA for this session. All right, everyone have a great day. Thank you.
Thank y'all.
Bye.